Good evening. I'm Lim Tahoon from Sungkyunkwan University. Today I'm going to talk about issues of geopolitics in the early history of SF in Korea. Geopolitics has been an important generative driver of science and technology ideals in shaping the global literary history of SF since the 19th century, but it has been a neglected topic in the history of Korean SF studies. In modern and contemporary Korean literary history, SF has tended to be discovered and evaluated through its relevance to science and technology. However, the historical relationship between SF and the imagination, driven by the geopolitical conditions and crises of the Korean peninsula, surrounded by great powers, has not been sufficiently recognized and is also understudied. In the geopolitical science fiction that this study aims to explore, we rediscover works that focus on possible wars, security crises, and drastic social changes in the future based on the hegemonic structure of great powers and territorial constraints. It's also about rethinking the lack of realism that South Korean readers have long felt in Korean SF narratives. Characters living in a poor, divided Asian country and the places where their daily lives are projected have been very difficult to make SF. There was a time when stories about spies were considered more realistic than encounters with aliens, space travel, or the benefits of cutting edge technology. Let's go back to 1907, when Jules Verne's the 20,000 Miles Under the Sea on 1869 was reprinted in the Tegugakbo. At a time when the country was falling apart, why was on 20,000 Miles Under the Sea is considered worth reading by the readers of Hakbo? And how does this relate to the translation of Jules Verne's The Legacy of the Queen of India into Iron World the following year, 1908? In the early history of Korean SF, the question of geopolitics is crucial to the choice of what to translate. The Legacy of the Indian Queen was translated by Morita Shiken and published in 1887 in the Japanese Collected Works. In China, it was translated by Pao Tianxiao through the Civilized Books Bureau in 1903. In Korea, it was published in 1908 by Haedong Seokwan as a Byonan novel. In all three cases, the translation name was Cheol Segi. The number of science fiction novels published in colonial Korea since Lee Haejo's Cheolsegi is small. However, despite the differences in their subject matter, these works share a common geopolitical configuration of the Far East. Jung Young-kyu's Ideal Village, 1921, an adaptation of Edward Bellamy's utopian science fiction, Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887, 1888. It describes the future of Seoul in 2023, which has become a socialist paradise. The protagonist, Jung Jong-ryung, is thrilled to see the highly developed Gyeongsong of the future in contrast to the smoky colonial Gyeongsong of the 1920s. However, the novel's imagination is doubly suppressed and interrupted, both within and without the work. The novel ends with the protagonist waking up and returning to a depressing reality. While much of this is similar to Looking Back, The Strange Village takes a much more radical imagination when it comes to labor and money. Bellamy's novel features flexible working hours and credit cards that are flexible depending on a number of conditions. In 2023 Gyeongsong, money doesn't exist at all, and the working day is no longer than an hour. If it were possible to rewrite with a more radical imagination and not stay within the confines of the original, wouldn't it have been possible to avoid the ending, that it was all just a dream? Why wasn't that the choice? Because the more we immerse ourselves in the utopian future of Gyeongsong, the more the contrasting reality of colonized Gyeongsong is awakened in the protagonist's consciousness. In the end, he cannot escape the compulsion to wake up and face reality. In order to immerse oneself more deeply in the dream of a futuristic utopia, rather than being easily awakened from it, we need a rational basis for immersion in the future from the conditions of the present. The more sparse and fanciful these are, the harder it is to both immerse ourselves in the future and sustain it. In Kim Dong-in's The Research of Dr. K, 1929, a doctor who has invented a technology to turn poop into food is looking for recognition for his unfinished research, so he turns to Germany, Japan, and the United States. This reminds me of what Frederick Jameson calls geopolitical aesthetics, the mindset of those in positions of geopolitical weakness is submerged in an attempt to contrast themselves with the center of the world system. They attempt to resolve their emptiness and anxiety with a desire for recognition and international acceptance by the great powers. This is why Dr. K came up with the world map. Hermunil's The Dragon Boy in the Sky, 1930, is not the story of a journey from Earth to Mars, but of a visit to Earth in 1930 from Mars, whose civilization is 700 years ahead of Earth's. What they find on arrival is a war zone of air raids and interceptions. Given the book's primary audience of children, one might expect them to dream of a utopia set in a Martian civilization, but the novel's protagonists, a scientist and a boy, are only thinking of going to Earth. When the story is published, it's 1 year before the Manchurian incident. In an attempt to escape the Great Depression of 1929, the Japanese military and business community are fomenting a war crisis in Manchuria. To think of Mars in space at this time, far from Far East Asia, is not free from the interference of geopolitical crises that overwhelm the imagination of the peninsular people. In the 1940s, in the run-up to the Second World War, we see geopolitics interfering more blatantly with the imagination. The setting of Namsansu's Sosinsul, 1941, is Shanghai's Samaro, an area that attracts foreign businessmen and visitors. The villain is Orland, a Westerner who owns a newspaper. He steals a device that makes objects smaller from Dr. Yang, a Korean, but is eventually deceived by his own greed and disappears. The confrontation in the novel is between the colonized Koreans and the white press operating in Shanghai. But it is typical of the way Imperial Japan mocks and curses the West. Shanghai, the setting of the novel, has been under Japanese control since the Sino-Japanese War and the Second Shanghai Incident in 1937. Until the end of the war in 1945, Anglo-Americans living in Shanghai had to endure all sorts of hardships. The Japanese were intoxicated with the illusion that, having conquered the territory of the Western powers in China, they could win the coming World War. Shinzidai was a magazine where such fantasies were openly displayed. In the January 1941 issue, Mamison In's Prospect of the Pacific optimistically predicted victory in a war with the Anglo-American powers, saying they would be no match for the mighty Japanese Navy. The following month, in the February issue, a novel called The Eagle of the Pacific was published. It's about a Japanese army armed with new weapons that defeats the enemy. The trend of geopolitical SF can be traced in colonial shipbuilding magazines, from the submarine novels of Osakawa Shunro in the 1900s to the secret battle fleet of Uno Juja, published during the Pacific War. Over the course of half a century, SF writing has struggled. Why has it been so limited? What has prevented the genre's imagination from being activated? It's worth remembering that from its earliest formative years, SF has relied on extrapolation as a basis for invention and composition. Originally, extrapolation meant extending a series of numbers in a logical order. Given 1, 2, and 3, the next numbers to be calculated are 4, 5, and 6. And by using the trend of 1, 2, 4, 7, and 11, we can predict the series 16, 22, and 29. Any form of extrapolation that extends the principle of increasing past a known endpoint is an exercise in mathematical logic. When it comes to dealing with historical time, extrapolation has applications in both fiction and non-fiction, in connecting the phenomenal present, or past, to an imagined future, or imagined present and past. We rely first on what can be verified, what is known by common sense. Extrapolation fills in the gaps by extending trends or tendencies from one period or body of knowledge to another. Extrapolation also provides greater plausibility and certainty when predicting the near future rather than the too distant future of history. In imagining a near future society, SF extrapolation re-examines the conditions that make up the reality of the here and now. It rearranges elements such as science and technology, politics, society, and economics, and redistributes the influence of each. From this, we can imagine possible futures, possible pasts and presents, and other futures that would emerge from the new timeline. Extrapolation, on the other hand, treats externalities that are not within the conditions of reality as improbable and unworthy of narrative. When forces such as Cold War ideology come into play, limiting our collective common sense and causing us to self-censor, Imagination and thought are inevitably stifled or halted, a phenomenon that is itself an example of sociological hard SF. When it comes to the inability of Korean SF to be produced in sufficient quantity and frequency over time, the absence of works should not be seen as a deficiency, but rather as a shift in thinking that recognizes the absence itself as SF. This is the perspective that my research on geopolitical SF seeks to provide. Thanks for listening.